pleased that we can be here to have a conversation on these critical themes. And it's stunning, I think I speak for all of us, to say not only are these themes so important that we can get together and have this conversation, but stunning that the technology has delivered, and it seems apparently that it can work, and we can actually do this remotely. What I'd like to do now is introduce the panelists as well as the topic, and as they come up onto stage, for so to speak, then present them with a single question, which I'll have them all answer one by one, which will try to crystallize the debate. And after the first 30 seconds in which we've all sort of put forward a single answer to this critical question, we'll start teasing it out and developing the themes themselves. So the panelists are, and the ones that you'll see in the program as well, are Renate Samson, who is the Principal Policy Advisor at the consumer rights organization, Which. We have Sahdya Darr, who leads the Open Rights Group on migration rights. We have Benjamin Mueller, who is the Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Data Innovation, and Michael Veale, who's an Associate Professor at University College London. Hello all. Thank you all for joining us today. Now, as you're all appearing on screen and getting ready for the panel, let me sort of be provocative and propose a question that we can all try to wrestle with very quickly. And I'd like to get your answer, and I'll choose an order for you. And the question is this: that Brexit is the best thing ever to happen for data rights in the United Kingdom because we can unshackle ourselves from the EU's GDPR and create a data strategy that's better for the economy, better for people, and unleashes productivity. So all those, do you believe that Brexit is the best thing ever to happen for data rights in Britain? So Renate, yes or no?
Can I go with maybe?
Sahdya, yes or no?
Emphatic no.
Yes or no?
No.
Benjamin? Benjamin possibly is on mute, possibly not here. Well, let's do this. Emphatic no versus maybe. Renate, explain yourself.
I think that the GDPR was always an excellent starting point. But of course, things move and shift and change. I'm not going to link that to Brexit. I'm going to link that to technology and use of data and opportunities. So rather than saying an outright no, I'm going to put a little bit of positivity in the air and suggest that if managed correctly, now whatever that means, there is the opportunity for some elements of GDPR to be built upon and to move with the times. That doesn't mean deregulation. That means taking what we've got and moving forward with it rather than backwards.
Okay. No, that's thoughtful, reasonable, well spoken, but that's not what I want right now from Benjamin. Benjamin, did you hear the question? And the question was, Brexit is the best thing ever happened to data rights because we can get rid of the GDPR and its shackles, be unshackled, and free this freedom-loving country to one in which we can get the proper use of data that finds the juste milieu, a French term, between protection and economic growth and innovation. What do you think?
Well, in the interest of stirring the debate a bit, I'm going to answer in the affirmative because I did hear the previous answers, and I think it's good to offer a counter perspective.
Fantastic. So apparently you're only playing along and you're saying something that you don't believe, but we'll get back to you in a second. Sahdya, you said emphatic no. Explain yourself.
So I think that privacy is power, and I think the government's proposals in the recent public consultation that they launched, Data in New Direction, I think that we're on a slippery slope if the government is going to go ahead and do away with that legislation that was largely put in place to protect the rights of citizens. And I mean, in my work at Open Rights Group, I look at the intersection between migrants' rights and digital rights. And I'm thinking about the impact that this will have, not just on all data subjects, but, data subjects that are highly vulnerable.
Okay, and why can't we have it both ways?
Well, I think that I'm sure all of us here have read the proposals. I mean, I think that I don't think innovation should come at the expense of privacy. I think that and I think that actually is what the government is pursuing with these proposals. It's innovation at the expense of privacy, and also at the expense of like building and developing trust, which is essential to innovation too.
Okay, Michael.
So I'm a legal scholar, and I take the question fairly literally. What does being in the EU mean? Well, it means a regulation is binding and can't be altered without another legislative process at EU level. And actually, surprisingly little about the GDPR that seems to be coming out in the data consultation, new directions, is actually relating to the binding nature of the GDPR at all. I think it doesn't recognize that the member states have huge scope in many different ways to alter and change the basis of the GDPR in UK law by providing new public interest means, by altering the way they enforce it, by providing new guidance. And when you read through as a legal scholar, you think, well, you could do this within the context of the GDPR. You could do this within the context of the GDPR. So there's a lot of desire to stir up the primary legislation with a deregulatory mode, rather than explore in full what you can do through statutory instruments and through changing the nature of enforcement and providing clarity on things like legitimate interests. Already the ICO is known for not regulating and enforcing in terms of fines and so on, and instead saying, we decide what we want to enforce based on strategic choices within the GDPR. So it's not like this is a regime where everything is followed to the letter the whole time. And it's not like you have to go back to primary legislation to change this. And I really have anybody who says we need to change X or Y about the UK GDPR, to me, needs to justify why that needs to be done in primary legislation at all. Because I have not seen convincing answers to this so far, and maybe they're not being creative enough or they haven't properly read the law.
Now I want to delve into that in a moment, but first, Benjamin, you warmly embraced the provocative question. So why do you say yes?
Well, to begin with, I think it's really important that we stress the nuances of this topic. And I think Michael's just done a great job of that. This is ultimately a question of studying the law and its application. And it's not necessarily a binary in terms of we're going to rip up GDPR and throw it all out the window and have a free-for-all. It's actually a question of what can be done both within and outside of GDPR in order to permit, innovations and directions in which we want technology to head that are on the whole good for society. And I'm thinking of things like permitting pseudonymization of data, or moving away from a model where you need to have a single data controller and having shared data controllers. There's lots of little bits and bobs that you can tinker around with that, at the margin provide a lot of added benefit to organizations and society as a whole, and may be acceptable in terms of the implications they have for the data privacy framework. But the key point is that the debate shouldn't be conducted against the sort of hysteric backdrop of we're all about to lose all our rights and protections. And I think that's why a nuanced approach of the kind that Michael just approached and Renate also alluded to is valuable in this discussion.
Okay, so what the sort of consensus position by Renate, Michael, and Benjamin is very reasonable, it's very thoughtful, it's sort of a middle of the ground approach that gives and takes. And this is going to be the world's most boring panel if you are so moderate and thoughtful like this. However, I'll allow that to be if that's what the ground truth requires. Let me shift slightly and delve into the question of what is and what could be. how will the EU, how will the UK interact with the GDPR in a post-Brexit environment, and how should it?
So is that directed at me?
Since you've just spoken, let me see if there's someone else who sort of through body language suggests that they want to pick up the chalice first. Michael, please.
Yeah, there are, the UK has to engage with the GDPR in a way that understands it's now a rule taker in these areas, particularly given Council of Europe Convention 108. The idea, the underlying framework of requiring a legal basis and transparency to process data and personal data as a definition being harmonized very heavily across the world means we just have to stick with these. Otherwise, we create friction for businesses, for governments, in understanding multiple definitions and categorizing data in different ways. And that's not going to come with any benefits because the GDPR is not a very restrictive instrument. It's actually quite a legitimizing instrument of what it allows you to do. I mean, look at what the big tech platforms do with data and don't get enforcement on the basis of, because they can interpret the law in an extremely permissive way, as they do. So what I think we can do, though, when we interact with these rules, I'm also putting e-privacy in this bundle as well, is consider how we can make data rights and data protection clearer and more concrete for people on this island. And what this means, for example, let's take cookie banners as an example. I know it's not data sharing necessarily, but cookie banners, they don't have a reject option. People get frustrated with them. They're very annoying. And there's been a lot of discussion about getting rid of them. But we can't unilaterally get recourse to make British companies and just get rid of them. But what we can do are things like rules that say, actually, when British consumers put a do not track signal in their browser, it is illegal to show them a cookie banner. It has to go for them. And that doesn't mean that we get rid of them or deny that they have to be done by businesses. But for consumers, it means that cookie banners do disappear in a way that countries around the world can adhere to in relation to British consumers. But if we try to say British websites don't have to do them, well, they'll say, well, we have to do them anyway because we have to serve them to European customers and other customers around the world. So, for example, these are quite clever ways in which we can use our extraterritoriality to make things clearer for us, but without trying to live in an unrealistic world where companies have to meet two standards, which just cost them more money. And I think that's kind of a pragmatic way forward. So thinking about more like what we can do here, make more clarity that we can provide in the UK, can create interesting leadership.
Now, Renate, I see you nodding your head.
I think one of the most interesting words and important words that Michael has just used is the word clear. And there's an opportunity here for greater transparency. What I'm particularly worried about is that there's a desire through some of the suggestions in the new approach in data, a new strategy, which sounds a little bit like the next Star Trek film, that it's putting consumers further away at arm's length from their data. We're hearing an awful lot about control. We're hearing an awful lot about innovation and growth. We also do know, and consumers do know, that data is an integral part of that. But consumers' data, more often than not, is integral. It is at the heart of innovation and growth and products and services. And yet some of what's being presented is putting us much further away. Now, I think that that's really troubling. I think that bringing people on board with an integral part of their life, data is an integral part of all of our lives, bringing people on board will help innovation and growth, keeping us further away, not allowing us to challenge automated decisions made about us, which is one option that's being presented, suggesting that we get rid of cookie banners because they're annoying, but then everything is strictly necessary, also undermines people's ability to be able to make a good decision for themselves and for their family. We talk an awful lot about vulnerable consumers. At any time, any one of us could become vulnerable, and vulnerability is often temporary. It's not necessarily a permanent state. These things often are spoken about, therefore, in binary terms. It's all black. It's not all black and white. There's often a lot of grey. And the further away consumers are kept from their data and kept from how innovation and growth is going to work, arguably, it might seem easier on the page, but actually it makes life much more difficult in the long term. Bringing people on board is a great opportunity for the future of data protection. Keeping us away, I would say, and deregulating will actually do us damage in the long term.
Now, Benjamin, you've been hearing both Renate and Michael interpret the idea of how the UK should interact with the GDPR and how it could in the future. How do you see the situation from your vantage point?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to try and bring this to life by giving a specific example of a potential reform or change to the GDPR framework that could deliver benefits to consumers without necessarily undermining the way in which they are protected. So currently under GDPR, users have a right to opt out of automated decision-making systems with significant effects. And obviously the logic behind that is very understandable and makes perfect sense. But the question is, does the evolving pace and capability of automated systems suggest that we might potentially benefit if, rather than having a sort of a blanket ban on generalized automated processing, we have a blanket permission and instead create specific protected categories of data that can't be automatically processed. And in legal terms, I guess the question would be whether there could be a shift away from looking at the means by which a decision was taken in terms of data processing, and instead looking at how the outcome can be challenged and looking at means of redress. That's a very specific, concrete proposal that I'm sure Michael and Renate have thoughts about, but you could conceivably make a change to the law that would create a more innovation-friendly environment and still keep users protected. I think I personally tend to approach the subject along those lines. What specific targeted interventions could the UK now undertake that it's left the GDPR framework? Another dimension that I think doesn't get sufficient attention is that the UK has very explicitly said it's looking to expand data transfer agreements across the globe. This is something that's proven very difficult for the EU to do because the process of awarding adequacy is quite heavily politicized. And even inside the EU, there's now frustrations that they're not able to set up these digital trade deals with as many jurisdictions as they want. And if the UK can lead the way, that might create a sort of a healthy incentive for the EU to follow suit. And then lastly, I just want to stress for the audience that the UK's data reform consultation is just that. It's a consultation. It's not by any means a program of announcements of what will be done. It's actually a very considered and studied document that I would urge all of you to take a look at, where GDPR is sort of explored comprehensively and different ideas are floated in order to canvass public and expert opinion on where to go next. And I think that's absolutely the right way forward for the UK.
Michael, let me hold off a second, and I want to just park adequacy on one side, automated decisions on the others, which I think you're going to weigh in on automated decisions. But first bring Sahdya into this, because when Renate brought up the idea of vulnerability, it brings up the question and the temporality of vulnerability of the question of vulnerable populations, and particularly of migrants and what privacy rights mean there. Now, Sahdya, we're talking generally, more broadly, about the question of how the UK should interact with the GDPR and how it might want to change or tailor it. How do you see these issues, particularly when it comes to the rights of migrants?
Thank you very much. I think for me, this also raises questions about our data protection culture as well. I think that we need to be establishing an all-encompassing culture of data protection. And I think rather than we need to withstand this pressure to do away with this legislation. I think, and we need to focus on building trust. There are already examples of where things have happened, which have, I would say, have had a huge impact on trust with vulnerable communities. And I'm not just talking about migrants. I'm talking about communities of color. I'm talking about people with disabilities. And I don't think that these groups are necessarily being thought of. In the work I do with migrants' rights, the whole process is data intensive, and GDPR protects the rights of those people. It may not be perfect, it may be annoying, people may find it annoying, but it does provide protections and allow people to seek redress should those protections be violated in any way, shape, or form.
Great. Now, Michael, you were chomping at the bit. Was it because of automated decisions, or was it for on a different topic?
It was mostly automated decisions, but you can
go for it. I'm really interested. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is an area of where there's a lot of misconception about what is currently allowed in the law and what's not and what's possible. So I've written several papers about this, never come across a business or an organization that claims that their decision even falls within Article 22 of the GDPR. So I think we're firstly looking at a policy issue which is kind of imaginary as a barrier to things. And I'd be interested from Benjamin if he has a concrete example of a kind of decision that is currently being prevented by this in terms of a sector or an area, because I think it's best to work with concrete examples. He said he provides them, but I think it's best to work with kind of concrete examples there rather than articles. But even if you find an example here, these decisions are permitted if they're necessary to perform a contract with a consumer. So in any commercial setting for products which consumers are seeking, then they're not a problem in this context. They're also permitted without requiring an opt-in if they're authorized by law. So that could be through secondary legislation. So immediately, like I said, without touching the primary legislation, the Secretary of State can say quite simply, we're finding that in this sector, where there might be a justification to have it opt out rather than opt in, and we'll just place this in a category in the end of the Data Protection Act and authorize it by law. So it's we can be super agile around this as we decide and locate areas of interest there. And so when you kind of dig down into what's actually a barrier here, I kind of feel like a lot of this is hot air that gets discussed around things like the barriers in the GDPR. Actually, people just need to be more creative with the way they look at the existing framework.
Fair enough, but let me turn it back to you and say, if very few things actually get ensnared in Article 22, what was the purpose of Article 22? Was just this simply sort of Brussels flattering itself that it could actually have a power that actually is meaningless in the real world, but also potentially be selectively employed when it suits its interests?
Well, Article 22 and the equivalent of that's been in the Data Protection Act 1998, as well as Article 15 of the Data Protection Act. So it's not a new provision that relates to this. It comes from...
Where was it strengthened?
It wasn't really strengthened very much, no. It comes effectively from this concern about a kind of Kafkaesque, particularly governing the public sector choices, where there may actually be a need to implement due process as you datafy the public sector. And so it comes to the idea that you actually need to have a legal basis or need to have certain rights when decisions are being made about you for your own dignity, if they're not involving humans or they're not involving processes of oversight. And even then it's quite weak because the categories are about significant decisions about individuals and so on. But I think it provides an important stopgap, but it's not a hindrance to innovation or the AI industry. And I'd be interested to know there's a concrete example of where it is.
Benjamin.
Yeah, so there's two things I want to say. First of all, your answer perfectly illustrated what I was saying at the beginning of the panel. This is a question of understanding the nuance of how to create a different environment for innovators and companies. And your discussion of achieving this via secondary legislation rather than touching GDPR is a great example of that. This is why it's important to conduct a debate without hyperbole. It doesn't necessarily have to be about changing GDPR per se. It's about looking at which kinds of rules could be amended and through what means in order to stimulate certain forms of technology and in this case automated decision making that we might want to see more of. And so shifting from opt-in to opt-out in certain sectors may be a very sensible thing to do. I'm not taking a view on whether Article 22 per se should be changed. I'm just raising it as an example of, in the future, we can expect to see more and more powerful and capable automated decision-making systems. And it's quite right to ask ourselves what kind of legislative framework provides the right balance between encouraging the development and adoption of such systems and the right channels of redress for users in different sectors. And one point about Article 22, and the philosophy behind it that I think should also be mentioned is that there's this underlying assumption that keeping a human in the loop is the right way to maintaining fairness and justice in the system, when of course there's plenty of decision-making areas such as credit decisioning, where we created credit scores as a way to automate decision-making and take bias out of it, because it used to be the case that you have to rock up at your local bank, where you were basically eyeballed by the credit officer, and it was an ideal route to discriminate against people. So my point is simply that the idea that humans are always going to provide a better and fairer decision than machines may itself be outdated and at the very least deserves further scrutiny and debate.
Yeah, this points to a larger issue, which is that just a few days ago, the British government has released its AI strategy. And one will wonder whether our data practices and our rules around data dovetail nicely with the ambitions of the government to unleash productivity and growth and jobs and innovation through an AI strategy. Does it? Is Britain on the right track, or is there something that we're doing that's wrong? I'm going to pick on Renate from a consumer interest standpoint. How do you...
I'm going to struggle to answer that question, but I want to just go back to the previous point, if I may. It's kind of the thing with face-to-face, and I'm not suggesting face-to-face, but having a human in the conversation is you can ask. Conversation is actually quite important. Being able to understand why computer says no is actually really critical. It's really critical for redress purposes. So there is a need for a mix here. Automating everything doesn't solve all the problems, and all the data also doesn't prevent bias from ending up in systems. Okay, so there's that. I just also want to go back to about opt-out. A scheme happened over the course of the summer. It's called, just to add to matters, the GP DPR. Which was about English patients in England's data from their medical record being uploaded onto a central system to enable research to happen. Now, which did some survey work, and we found that roughly half the country didn't know about this scheme. That as in English patients didn't know. Patients in England didn't know about the scheme. So therefore, they didn't know that they had the choice to opt out of it. Those that did opt out, and in the summer it was 3.1 million people, the government reported, had opted out of it. Now that's quite a phenomenal amount of people, and we found through our survey work that some of the reasons why they were opting out was A, that they didn't feel they had enough information. So transparency and communication and honest communication is really important. But B, the information they were getting wasn't necessarily from reliable sources. So misinformation and disinformation online was leading to it's going to be US pharmaceutical companies who are buying my data. Now, government, the NHS said that that wasn't actually going to be the case. But because that information wasn't clearly available for people to be able to access and see and to understand and make an informed decision for themselves about what they wanted to do, it led to a situation where there's now mistrust. There's a lot of misinformation or potential misinformation out there, but also people are opting out. Now, it's really important. Data is really important for societal decision making. It's not always all about personal data. And that's another really important point we need to make here, particularly around AI strategies. We can't keep talking about the data. There's no such thing as the data. Data can mean an awful lot of different things. It's not always personal. It can be pseudonymized. It can be anonymized. That we can also be re-identified. Sometimes it's not even about us. As we continue on this journey, we need to change our language. We need to be better at explaining what we're all talking about. We need to be clearer about what data is and what the risks as well as the benefits are. And we need to put people in the middle of this. You know, explaining stuff to people shouldn't be seen as inhibitive. It should be seen as an opportunity.
Okay, so who and how? And let me go back to you, Renate, on this. Who in government should be the one to make the case, and how can they effectively make the case? In the case of healthcare data, it is pretty outrageous considering everybody who took the time to bother to get off the list are the very people who are sort of committed to probably having very good healthcare because they take such an active interest in it, that would probably want to have better healthcare that is, more effective and wider distributed and less expensive with better patient outcomes that the data could provide. So it's almost counterintuitive, in fact, self-defeating, that they would be the ones to step aside. So tell me, when you come off of mute, who in government should be the one to have the leadership role in this, and how might they be able to be effective?
I don't like saying who and how. It's all of us, right? Let's not try and insert a blame game into this. No, I'm being serious. No, I'm being really serious. It is all of us. We've got an awful lot of positive language coming out of government right now, and it's all about the benefits of data. Yet, at the other hand, we've also just heard from the minister about the online safety bill. We are now trying to unpick profound societal harms. It's not, we must always talk it up. We must always change the dial so that people can feel reassured. People's concerns are valuable concerns, but equally we then hear, well, the press are only ever talking about data breaches or loss of data. Yet at the same time, the front page of most newspapers is how data has helped us understand the pandemic. It's not as binary as everyone likes to make it out to be, and that's why I'm not going to give you a who and a how. I'm going to say all of us, all the time, and honesty. I really do worry that there's this idea that people are stupid, or that people, if they challenge or they don't want to share their data, it's because they're ignorant or they're just fearful. We make very nuanced decisions all the time, and Benjamin said earlier about it's about understanding the nuance. Well, that comes down to people as well. I can be willing to share my data for one reason and not for another, and that's perfectly reasonable of me to be able to do that. We make decisions based on our circumstances, based on decisions about family and a wide variety of issues. The more honest we can be, and the more we can talk about what data and why and what controls and choice we have about it, the better for all of us. And that will ultimately improve innovation and growth as well, I believe.
Sahdya, let me bring you into this. You're nodding. What's your view?
I'm nodding because when you asked who, this is something that actually Open Rights Group raised in our response to the National Data Strategy consultation. We recognized that there hadn't actually been involvement with communities, and that's a huge part of our work at Open Rights Group. So there'd been no engagement. I think I agree with what Renate says about assuming, that people don't know. People do know, and people also make decisions based on their experience. So migrants, for example, are going to make decisions about data based on their experience. And I just actually wanted to bring in an example. We recently produced a briefing document for the community and social sector, and we looked at how the government's proposals would affect different groups in society. And I just wanted to speak about something that happened last year. So you may or may not know that last year the Home Office was forced to stop using a racist algorithm that basically was sorting applications on the basis of problematic and biased criteria like nationality. And so what that meant was an individual visa applicant was allocated by the algorithm to the red category because of their nationality, which meant they had much lower prospects of a successful application than someone who had been put in the green category. And so that if they were forced to scrap the system under the threat of judicial review, and agreed to put in place protections such as equality impact assessments and data protection impact assessments. And if the government was to go ahead with its proposals, if it was to go ahead with scrapping Article 22, this would allow for automated decisions like sorting visa applications to be taken opaquely and without human review, and allow these systems to be deployed without properly assessing them for the risks that they might have to individuals. So I think these are really important things that we need to take into consideration. I agree also with Renate that all we do seem to hear, there are definitely, Open Rights Group would not disagree that there are not positive aspects to for data sharing, for example, but these also come with consequences that can be very serious for people.
Michael, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I'll come in on that. I think that so there is a lot that can be improved in this sector through stronger guidance and similar data protection impact assessments and similar to those. But I mean, we also have to kind of point out some of the kind of elephants in the room in this space, and some of the elephants in the room, I think, are the very, very large platforms in this situation. And so when your question initially about the AI strategy and similar almost totally ignores the way that AI systems are being built and developed today, which is without data. And that might sound surprising to some people in the audience, but companies like Apple and Google illustrate very clearly that you don't need the data, you just need control of the infrastructure. You need the ability to control, to run code on individuals' devices at the end of processes, and then effectively you can learn and personalize a huge amount about them. And that's the way they've been moving their businesses in the last 3 or 4 years in particular. To point out that if you control that, you don't need to be able to see data in the raw. But we're still talking about, as Renate said, the data, as if it is this kind of concept. We're not talking about the structures of power that underline this. And if we want the UK to be a leader in creating AI, we probably have to recognize that Apple and Google do not want the UK to be a leader in AI because they want to be leaders in AI. They want to control and intermediate this, and they want to be the most upstream actors that can turn the tap on and off and decide how to extract value from this system. And this is kind of tangential to data protection, but you have to see them together, because data protection is still based on the idea that we have to govern personal data that we can kind of see. But what we're seeing now is that in order to restructure power for the purpose of innovation, we have to govern infrastructures, even what would be considered, maybe argued by Apple and Google, to be anonymous data. Because these sort of anonymous systems, look at the Apple scanning, on-phone scanning, for example, developing machine learning models, using everybody's devices in tandem, and they can claim we can see none of this data. This is power, and this is the ability to train models in a very, very powerful way that disintermediates any hope for innovation, small SMEs, and the same. So we have to cast focus on this really carefully, because it's these infrastructures that draw power from our small SMEs, that draw power and decision-making from governments, draw power in so many ways into a sector which is not pro-innovation. It's becoming a vampire squid. It's becoming a sector that actually kills and bricks innovation, that it takes away value or threatens its model. And so we have to draw careful attention to this. I know we've got the great Digital Markets Unit in the UK thinking about this, and the Digital Market Act in the EU is doing interesting work there. But we have to draw attention closely to these things, because without this, there is not going to be a hope, because it's not about finding a data set and training a nifty model and operating it anymore. It's about who is control of these infrastructures for experimenting on people in the world and optimizing systems, because it's only with those you can build the kind of dynamic systems that the big US tech giants do. And that's what I think worries me, that we're kind of missing the boat on regulating a space for innovation in the UK.
We're supposed to go to questions from the audience. We're not going to go to questions from the audience. Benjamin pursed his lips. Benjamin.
Yeah, I think Michael raises a lot of really interesting points by bringing in AI. So in the first instance, my view is that we're at the cusp really of a sort of sustained and protracted period of advancement and progress in AI. We're nowhere near this new approach having reached anything close to maturity. And this is precisely why it is so important to set up the right governance structures now, as in how to encourage the development and uptake of AI. And I think the UK's AI strategy tries to address exactly that question of how do we encourage the broadest possible basis of AI development in this country. And it does so through investment, it does so through talent visas, but it also does so by committing to researching, setting up standards to regulate algorithmic transparency, trustworthiness, explainability, all the kinds of tools that will encourage people to actually trust these technologies, but also giving businesses the right incentives to participate and invest in AI. And as far as the various models go of how to train and build AI systems, one thing I would point out is that at the moment it's very difficult for businesses, small businesses, to train AI and machine learning systems on data that they have collected through interacting with users, because that could be deemed repurposing, even if this data has been pseudonymized, and you're then trying to internally do some research to build some kind of machine learning model based off of it. That's certainly there's some barriers thrown in the way there by GDPR, and so there are some interactions certainly to data protection frameworks, and they're worth looking at, I think.
Legitimate interest in these spaces. I mean, that's kind of boils down to this. I mean, you look through every privacy policy and you see, we're going to use your data to research and produce and improve our services. In every single policy, and we'll do it on an opt-out, or not even an opt-out basis, a basis where you can't opt out. I find it ridiculous to say this is actually, in practice, a barrier, and we have to contest with the political economy of this. Yeah, businesses find it difficult to train on AI because they've got such a tiny, weeny amount of data. So what you see is Google and Apple and Amazon selling them big general purpose models, saying, well, you can feed your tiny bit of data into our giant model we've created, and we'll deliver you this model as a service forevermore and extract value from your business and inextricably tie this together. So any investment you put in this business is nonsense, because you have to grapple with the political economy of AI, which is that businesses don't have enough data to train. And just because businesses club up together doesn't mean they're going to have enough data to train. They're going to end up in these power relationships where their money and innovation is being extracted overseas. And if they become a threat to a large AI company, they'll just be bought. So that's the reality of the UK.
I think it's wrong to say that it's a bad idea to put money into AI investment. The purpose of any such investment is to say, can I deliver a better service in the marketplace? And if there are viable ways to achieve that, then it makes sense to put money behind it. And this also relates to my point about the AI strategy, thinking about some of these issues, for instance, by looking at setting up sort of a public cloud compute infrastructure to ensure even access to this type of these type of research methods. And I again, it's just a question of nuance, and it's simply not always the case that these models are trained on proprietary data. GPT-3, one of the most powerful models that exists, was trained on publicly available internet text, and the real constraint there was the cost of compute required to train the data, and that's something that a publicly subsidized cloud compute infrastructure could solve. So I just want to sort of steer away from blanket statements and encourage looking at the nuance of the various issues.
Renate, you come from a background both as the former CEO of Big Brother Watch, while at the same time working for a consumer rights organization. How do you think through this debate?
I mean, and also in the middle, a period of time at looking at the Open Data Institute, which I think is also very relevant to the conversation that's just happened between Benjamin and Michael. And it's actually a really important point. There's an awful lot of emphasis at the moment that it's people need to stop hoarding their data or not providing access to their data or worrying about their data. Well, the same does apply to big companies as well. And we certainly saw that during the pandemic, that access to data that would have helped move things forward very, very quickly in relation to managing the pandemic, not just the health aspects of it, but the societal aspects of it, was problematic. So there's that as well. But I mean, I think throughout all the jobs that I've done and all the roles that I've held in relation to data, whether it's open, privacy, security, consumer rights, whatever, people are always at the heart of all of this. And that's why I bang on and have done in this session about engagement with people properly. We are all our data, right? But also it's not ours. Right now, me talking, there's all of us on this screen. It's about all of us here. Data is about us. Data can provide huge amounts of value. People aren't stupid. People need better information, and it's not about teaching them. It's about being open and honest and trustworthy, and also about the right to say no and interrogate and challenge. The further away we are kept from our data or from understanding what our data and everybody's data about us is doing, the more worrying this is. And I've made that point repeatedly, so I'm not going to make it again.
Sahdya, I see you nodding as well.
Yeah, I think the points that Michael and Renate made, well, Renate made about people and that Michael made about power are just so important. Those two things, like, you know, they really need to be thought about. I think I'd end by saying that I'd again reiterated something that Michael said. I said I don't think we should be seeing this kind of regulation as a barrier to prosperity. We need to change the way that we think and see it as, the first step that, towards innovation, the first step that, for example, companies should take. And also, I think we need to be thinking about, rather than doing away, adapting and improving our policies, especially in an environment that's rapidly changing. And I think when I say this, I mean this both politically and technologically. I was doing actually a bit of reading before this panel discussion, looking at what UNHCR, the UN Refugee Rights Organization, its take on data protection, and something that one of their legal policy officers said, that it's not actually, the problem isn't the data protection principles. The problem arises if those responsible think of these things too late in the process. So yeah, I think I just end on that.
Right. Okay. So we do want to bring in the audience and the audience questions to this conversation. For those of you who are listening, who are attending, I encourage you to look at the Q&A portion of this to find out the totality of what some of you have come up with as very thoughtful questions, and we don't have time for it. Questions that are sometimes quite nitty-gritty about adequacy rules and the EU helping to sort of modify or interact with GDPR. But what I would like to do is just bring up two of them and have the panel respond to one or the other that they think might be appropriate. So the first one, which harkens back to something that we've just spoken about, but I just want to present to you, is a question by one of the attendees that said, does the panel agree with Eric Schmidt, former chairman of Google, that the EU AI Act transparency requirements constitute a, quote, very big setback, unquote, for Europe? Okay? And then the second, and that's interesting because we've also spoken about the value of transparency and sort of the necessary need for that as a potential solution to some of the problems that we have. The second question, which I thought was interesting, is could national or regional data regimes evolve to become global, multi-stakeholder, self-coordinating governance processes? And what's interesting about that question is that it aligns very nicely with the IGF. The Internet Governance Forum is in fact born of this idea of a multi-stakeholder self-governing process to deal with digital challenges that transcend borders, that can do better in this sort of bottom-up consensual approach of iteration through policymaking, rather than just sort of the top-down nation state or super nation state element to it. Both of those are very interesting questions. I think we're gonna have to end on that because we only have 4 minutes left. So why don't, Michael, you're ready for one. Take it away.
It's interesting. I think Eric Schmidt isn't an EU lawyer, so he might need to get a bit more training on this. The transparency requirements the AI Act he's referring to effectively say that in a very small number of sectors that are considered to be high risk, those sector lists can change, and this is the very beginning of a process of legislation, so they may change. These are things like dispatching emergency responders, predictive policing, education, which is probably the most wide one that might need to be narrowed down a bit, and employment, so automatic hiring and firing and these kind of questions. If you are a company, you are selling something that is destined and is purposed for one of these very specific sectors, which is a tiny section of the AI market in general, then when you put it on the market, you have to ensure the transparency is available to the users of the system, which means the people who are in the company who buys it, such that they can oversee it responsibly in practice. And it's only as necessary. It's not explaining every decision to every user or anything like that, not to the end user. It is about selling products that can be safely used in certain situations. And the trade-off for this is that the current proposal, the EU forbids member states from placing further transparency requirements on any AI product that is not within those categories. So it is actually a ban on member states making laws that restrict the use of AI and add additional transparency requirements in anything but these high-risk sectors. So probably what Eric Schmidt, an EU lawyer, would realize is that that actually will enable almost every AI provider to know that they they can sell without any obligations of transparency being placed upon them because of harmonization and preemption. So you might need to read up a bit more to look at that, but I think that should probably change. But the AI Act is more deregulatory in that transparency area than regulatory.
Thank you. Sahdya, let me turn to you. We only have a few, just 2 minutes left, so these are going to be sort of almost closing statements on perhaps the questions I asked or the totality of this conversation. But please, over to you. If you're on mute. Yeah.
Mic off, yes, I saw. So I would say that I think with regards to that question, I think that transparency is like imperative. And I actually think that this makes sure that people actually can, again, coming back to that, the thing of trust, it makes sure that people can trust what, or go some way towards making sure that people can trust what AI has to offer.
Great, thank you. Renate.
Crumbs. Where do I even start? I'm just going to give a much broader summary. Consumers, and it's not just about consumers. I did see in the chat, of course, it's not about consumers. It's about people, but we are all citizens and consumers. And a lot of the data that we share with AI systems, with Internet of Things, with the internet is often in our role as a consumer as well as in our role as a citizen. We need to be at the heart of all of this, and that means being able to challenge and say no, as well as saying yes, but understanding where the benefits come from, not being told the benefits are for us without knowing why, how, when, etc. So I look forward to seeing where the conversation is going to go.
Benjamin.
Yeah, I just want to actually address the second question from the public that you raised and finish on that. I think it's really important in the age of sort of digitized, globalized commerce that we try and adapt our regulatory frameworks for that and think of ways to create interoperable and harmonized approaches to facilitate the free flow of data across borders, because I do really think if regulated the right way, it's going to be an engine for prosperity and progress. So I just want to stress that is really an area that's been overlooked, the rise of data protectionism and localization. I want to stress that there are real benefits to be reaped if we re-energize policy efforts to create a sort of multi-stakeholder and multilateral forum to discuss how to encourage data flows.
Great, thank you. Let me add my own 2 cents, which is simply to say that what I've learned from this session comes back from some of the earlier comments by Michael and others, which is that the GDPR's definitions are very important because they sort of become broadly applicable across borders and enable the trade in data and the flow of data. And so keeping just that definitional standardized aspect of it is useful, a little bit like TCP/IP, the Internet Protocol, allowing for the interconnection of networks across borders as well, which is what the IGF supports as well. So I want to please join me in thanking the panelists, Renate Samson, Michael Veale, Benjamin Mueller, and Sahdya Darr, and stay on for the rest of the sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kenneth. That was a really lively session. Some great contributions, and also some great contributions in the chat. So thank you so much for that.